I'd like to begin by welcoming our new clerk, Daniel Widmer. Also, Mr. Mielo, welcome to the committee, and also to all of the witnesses. This is meeting number 12 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Human Resources, Skills and Social Development, the Status of Persons with Disabilities. The meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the House Order of January 25th, yesterday. Proceedings will be made available via the House of Commons website. The webcast will always show the person speaking rather than the entirety of the committee. In order to ensure an orderly meeting, I would like to outline a few rules to follow. Members and witnesses can speak in the official language of their choice. Interpretation services are available for this meeting. You have the choice on the bottom of your screen of either floor, English, or French. Before speaking, please wait until I recognize you by name. And if you are participating by video conference, please click on the microphone icon to unmute yourself. When you are done speaking, please put your mic on mute to minimize any interference. Should any technical challenges arise, please notify me if you can. If not, we'll pay close attention. If that happens, of course, it may be necessary to suspend for a few minutes to make sure that all members are able to participate fully. Pursuant to Standing Order 108 Sub 2 and the motion adopted by the committee on Friday, October the 9th, 2020, the committee resumes its study of urban, rural, and northern Indigenous housing. I'd like to welcome our witnesses to begin our discussion with 5 minutes of opening remarks, followed by questions from the Aboriginal Housing Management Association, Margaret Foe, Chief Executive Officer, and from the Kenora District Services Board, Henry Wall, Chief Administrative Officer. We're going to start with Ms. Foe, please, for 5 minutes. Welcome to the committee. You have the floor.
In the language of my ancestors, Ni'it, hello everyone. Thank you for having us here. Toyak Sim, thank you all. I'd like to just start off by talking a little bit about our organization. As Canada's first Indigenous grassroots housing authority, the Aboriginal Housing Management Association, HUMA, was created for Indigenous people by Indigenous people. In addition to providing families with affordable and culturally appropriate housing, HUMA's members offer many support services through 39 different programs, including homelessness prevention, transition homes, parenting skills, mental health programs, substance use, support, and more. As an Indigenous organization, HUMA always brings cultural components to its relationship with its members. We recognize the dispossession of Indigenous peoples caused by the Canadian government through a history of residential schools, the 60s scoop, and the general consequences of colonization. I just want to take a brief moment to clarify the distinction of what we mean when we say Indigenous. And as you already titled your witnessing here, you've heard the term urban, rural, and northern. We are the dispossessed, the disenfranchised from our sense of belonging to the three distinction-based groups, and having founded our own sense of community and belonging in the urban, rural, and northern environments. We are the non-status, the status unknown, the migrating, and the immigrant of the spectrums you refer to as the distinction-based groups. And we know that in any given community of ours within BC, our providers' clients comprise of about 30% local nations, which means their communities are largely outside the scope of those three distinction-based groups. HUMA continues to work with its communities to reclaim self-determination through culturally appropriate housing that honors Indigenous traditions in meaningful ways. Following the 2019 federal election, the Indigenous housing sector in BC and across Canada heaved a sigh of relief to see that Minister Hussain was mandated to create a national urban Indigenous housing strategy. However, a year later, we are disheartened to see no tangible progress on this file. Considering the significant time and effort that has to be invested in this initiative and the wide consultation process that has to take place, we see the delay in initiating this project as a significant threat to its conception, notably in a minority government environment. For this reason, HUMA's Board of Directors have decided to invest our own funding to create a BC urban and rural Indigenous housing strategy, with the hope that once completed, it will be considered for funding by our federal government. perhaps a tripartite strategy that could be replicated in other provinces, such as Ontario with such a strong provincial Indigenous leader as the Ontario Aboriginal Nonprofit Housing Association and their leader Justin Marchand, and many others across the country. As an advisory committee composed of many internal and external stakeholders will oversee this progress and the development of the strategy and ensure that a vast and meaningful consultation is a crucial component of it. The BC Urban, Rural, and Northern Indigenous Housing Strategy will achieve multiple things, including define and understand who the urban, rural, and northern Indigenous housing and service providers are, and measure their social and economic impact in supporting Indigenous peoples. It will define current challenges in the delivery of urban, rural, and northern Indigenous housing and propose solutions to bridge the gaps. It will assess BC's Indigenous, urban, rural, and northern housing needs and develop a 10-year plan to respond to those needs, not only fixing existing stock, building new units, but also creating new and culturally appropriate housing programs. It will also develop an implementation and delivery plan that identifies the role of HUMA, member organizations, funders, and partners, assess and build capacities for HUMA membership in housing-related domains, and finally, identify key partners to support the implementation of the strategy. To be specific, municipalities, MLAs, MPs, other Indigenous organizations, and so on. Because only through meaningful engagement with HUMA and Indigenous housing and service partners across Canada can the social, economic, and Indigenous rights of urban, rural, and northern Indigenous peoples in Canada be claimed and protected. Toyak Sim, thank you all for having me. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Ms. Foe. Now we're going to hear from Mr. Wall, please, for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon. Thank you to the chair and to the members of the Standing Committee for the opportunity to speak to you today. I join you today from the community of Dryden in northwestern Ontario, which sits on the lands of the Anishinaabe Nation in Treaty 3. We also sit on the traditional territory of Wabigoon First Nation and Eagle Lake First Nation. And I just want to do an acknowledgement to the elders, our elders that have been praying and are praying at the meeting today, that our words will be clear and well understood so that it can actually result in meaningful action. My name is Henry Wall, and I serve as the Chief Administrative Officer for the Kenora District Services Board, or as KDSB, as I'll keep referring to it. KDSB is responsible for the delivery of paramedic land ambulance services across the district. We are responsible for social assistance that includes poverty reduction programs, employment readiness and life stabilization programs, financial assistance. We also oversee childcare and early years development programs across the district. Last but not least, housing and homelessness prevention across the district of Kenora, which I have to say is 407,000 square kilometers. So you can fit most of Europe into our district and the area of our responsibility when it comes to housing and homelessness. I do want to say miigwech to the members of this committee that I know that really supported us and helped us from all sides of the House to finally have KDSB and our district be designated a designated community under the Reaching Home program. And that just happened in March. Thank you so much for that, miigwech. It couldn't have come at a better time given the pandemic. Having such a broad mandate certainly gives us a very interesting perspective in terms of the realities that families in our region face. I tell you, it's not by accident or coincidence that in the district of Kenora that we have that 7th highest rate of families with children living in poverty of all 338 federal ridings in Canada. Our wait list for affordable housing has increased by 257% since 2011. And as of August 2020, we had over 1,363 households and families who were approved waiting for affordable housing. And so that is just families who have not given up on the hope of finally attaining housing. I also want to say that on an annual basis, our 3 emergency shelters in the district that KDSB supports and funds, we support over 2,100 unique individuals each and every single year. Over 2,000 of those individuals are First Nation every year. So when you look at it from a context of a rural standpoint, it's 2,000 people. That's the size of many communities across Canada's rural part. Pre-COVID, we estimate that we had approximately 393 individuals who were homeless at any given time off reserve. That represents about 1.08% of our overall population. Now we have the pandemic, and I can tell you it is much worse just with the sheer number of individuals that have been displaced out of their communities, displaced out of the correctional system, displaced out of the healthcare system, and displaced out of the child welfare system. And I say those things. In 2018, when we did our homeless enumeration study, we found that 18% of our homeless population was incarcerated at the time of the study. In other words, 1 in 5 of our homeless are in jail at any given time. In fact, that year, we also found that Canada and Ontario spend more money housing Indigenous homeless people in the Kenora jail than you do combined provide funding to KDSP when it comes to housing and homelessness prevention. So when we talk about financial sustainability, I can tell you that the path that existing systems are on in our region is not sustainable, and it's not doing us any favors, which is why a strategy is needed. I also want to say that, not having safe, attainable, and affordable housing in our district, and I say attainable is really important, especially when it comes to Indigenous people, because it matters if you're Indigenous or not, if you can attain housing very often. But I do want to say is that because of that, what we're seeing is that our housing continuum has expanded to include the jails, the child welfare system, and our healthcare system, and our streets. And that is not just inappropriate, but as a country, we should stand for it. So I want to applaud the work that's taking place on the committee. I want to say that we need a housing strategy that will commit long-term stable flow of financial resources that our communities can, on our own terms, develop our capacity to build and create homes for our families. We need a housing strategy that allows for flexibility in order for communities to build homes that meet the cultural needs of the families that live in our communities, both on and off reserve. And we need a housing strategy that supports and empowers partnerships between municipalities and First Nation communities so that we can come together to build homes where they're needed, not where it's convenient for government to place them or where jurisdictional limitations of existing programs dictate where it should be. So in closing, I just want to say thank you for the opportunity today. And I also want to state that if Canada is serious about making progress on reconciliation, then we cannot forget that we do need to have a housing strategy that is inclusive to all, that is specific, that is progressive, aggressive, and ensures that all families have a home and a place to be. And with that, I think it's imperative that we recognize that not much else matters to families unless they have a safe, attainable, and affordable home of their own. And there's a difference between having a house and a home, especially when we're talking from an Indigenous perspective. Thank you very much, Chi Miigwech.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wall. We're going to begin now with rounds of questions, starting with the Conservatives. Mr. Viss, please, for 6 minutes.
First off, I'd like to begin by thanking Mrs. Foe and Mr. Wall for appearing today. I really appreciated the intensity of both your opening statements and the amount of information you cover. That's very, very helpful and very well presented. Let me just begin by saying that I have a lot to learn on this file, and I admit that because I want to be able to do my best to get some things right for Indigenous people. And I have a lot of work to do, and the Conservative Party has a lot of work to do to get things right. To Ms. Foe, I'm assuming that you believe that the government of Canada has not. I understand that we all agree here. I think that the government of Canada is not meeting its housing requirement to urban Indigenous people. But would you be able to provide any context in terms of what would be adequate housing for urban Indigenous Canadians?
Toyaksitnin, Brad, thank you. For us, it really comes down to the old cliche of nothing about us without us. And, to be clear from my perspective and from the many organizations that I work with, not just HUMA, but with the Canadian Housing and Renewal Association, their Indigenous Caucus. I've also sat with Leilani Farah as the previous UN Special Rapporteur to Housing and her ad hoc coalition and the OFIFC. We've all had conversations about what that really looks like and what that means. And it really means that we have an opportunity as urban Indigenous people to sit at the design table, to actually speak with government as an equal partner in the creation of what that looks like. Because housing, as Henry talked to, it's more than just the bricks and mortar. It's about giving a sense of home. It's about giving a sense of belonging. And for the dispossessed and disenfranchised people that have been living in urban areas, for a long, long time, that looks different than just your standard bricks and mortar.
Okay, thank you. Just to understand the unique governance model that does exist in British Columbia, AHMA was formed in approximately 2012, 2013, when CMHC divulged its responsibility to BC Housing and subsequently to your organization. What's your relationship with CMHC today?
Well, it's interesting. Minister Duclos and I had a good conversation prior to him being succeeded by Minister Hassan. And our organization actually dates back to the 1990s. The Grassroots Foundation started with devolution of the housing programs across the country from the federal government to the provinces. And we were fortunate here that the province of BC agreed that for Indigenous by Indigenous should exist even back then, and had a strong commitment to allow us to be at the table to negotiate how that transfer would happen. CMHC of the day said, we don't care what you do with this program as long as poor Indians get housed. The province of BC was fortunate enough to say, we actually want them to decide for themselves how that looks like, and that is the current iteration of HUMA. Evan Siddell is a breath of fresh air, and I have to say that we've seen a lot of genuine interest in their processes and in their communication strategies to actually interact with us and have conversations. When the Rapid Housing Initiative was released, I reached out to Evan and I asked him to treat HUMA as a municipality because of our broad representation. And if they're going to make allocations to municipalities, we would like to get a lump sum allocation for our programs. He said no, but he said he's not opposed to that idea. And we continue to work with them today in what that could look like going forward. So I'd say it's good. It's better than it was.
That's really good to hear. In previous testimony, CMHC informed the committee that they have 75 dedicated workers on Indigenous housing issues across Canada. So from what I'm hearing from you, you would say that those dedicated staff working in partnership on an equal basis with either housing organizations such as yours or directly with First Nations has been an improvement from CMHC.
Yeah, you know, to be clear, the wheels of change take time, and you know, I think there's a lot of good people. There's been a lot of good people in government and in government organizations like CMHC, but I think that it's very easy to fall back into the old systems of colonialism, which is I hear you, and then do it the way they thought they should do it, rather than actually allowing the Indigenous representation to help truly drive the solution. And I would say, based on my last conversation with Evan Siddell and Romy Bowers, that it seems that there is a genuine interest. They phrased it as, we'd like to hear how you think things should be done, and then we will support you. So it sounds a little bit different.
Thank you. I'm very enthused to hear that you guys have just gone ahead and taking control of your own destiny, and you're building your own strategy, not only for British Columbia, but possibly as a model for the entire country. Do you have any preliminary numbers that you would be able to share with this committee in terms of a financial number that you would expect the Government of Canada to fulfill to meet its constitutional requirement to provide adequate housing to urban Indigenous Canadians in British Columbia in your context?
Sorry, I forget. I'm trying to be respectful and hit the mute button as often as I can. So yeah, we've done a number of research documents leading up to our current onset of the strategy. We have a study that was done in partnership with UBC, University of British Columbia, and a number of other housing-focused entities here in BC that talks about the municipality lens of housing and what needs to happen within the municipalities to garner the support needed to actually affect change. Because it's great if the federal government gives out, you know, all sorts of money and funding streams and programs, but if municipalities and provincial governments aren't coming to the table as equal partners, we often see that there's huge gaps, especially in the Indigenous housing sector, to respond effectively to some of these calls to action. So I'm happy to share with this committee the Cleo Breton report, which shows there's massive gaps in municipalities between what they say they're trying to do and what they're actually doing in terms of a housing commitment. But we also did a study from Urban Matters that did an economic analysis on the impact of urban Indigenous housing programs to the community and to levels of government. And what we discovered a number of things. And again, I'm happy to share those reports with this committee afterwards. And I apologize, I should have thought to have sent it with you with our briefing documents. But we certainly discovered that here in British Columbia, since our inception in the 1990s, that for every dollar that's invested in urban Indigenous housing, we spin off 230% back to the community. And again, happy to share that so you can see where the data and the analysis comes. What we also discovered, and I can't speak to an actual dollar amount, but we have 8 key findings that speaks to a number of target populations, including youth aging out of care, elders aging into care, and then women and girls fleeing domestic violence or violence within their community as some of the growing cases as a consequence of COVID.
Thank you, Ms. Fo. I have to stop you there. We're about 2 minutes over time. The reports that you suggested, we'd be happy to receive those after the meeting at your convenience. Thank you, Mr. Biss. We're going to move now to Mr. Long, please, for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good afternoon, colleagues, and thank you very much to the witnesses for your testimony this afternoon. I am speaking to you on the unceded land of the Wolastoqey peoples, and I've been on HUMA for just entering my 6th year now, and I know not of a more important study. So, Ms. Fo, my initial questions are for you. Again, I want to thank you for sharing your perspective and the incredible work you do and HUMA are doing in BC. But I did want to ask you for your thoughts on Vancouver Community's entity under the designated community stream of Reaching Home being changed from Van City to LUMA in the past year. How has the transition to an Indigenous-led entity affected the delivery supports for those experiencing homelessness in your area, and particular Indigenous folks who are experiencing homelessness there?
Thank you for that.
I raised my hand. I'm sorry. Our dear interpreters really were having a hard time interpreting into French, interpreting the member into French, unfortunately. Can we get the question again, please? It's not your fault.
Merci, Madame Chabot. Mr. Long, no, you've got the standard issue headset. Madam Clerk, I wonder if you could help us out here.
Could he bring the microphone a little closer to his mouth? Mr. Long?
Sure.
Could you give it a test again?
Test 1, 2, 3. Good afternoon. Ms. Fo, thank you for coming this afternoon.
A little higher up, please, Mr. Long.
Higher. How's that? Does that sound better? Good afternoon to everybody.
A little higher, please.
A little higher would be off my head.
Just the microphone itself.
Okay, how about that? How about that?
That's good. Thank you, Mr. Long.
Okay.
Okay, Mr. Long, I think Madame Chabot was unable to hear your question. I know that there was a lengthy preamble, but if you could ask we'll restart the clock. If you could please repose the question. Thank you.
Sure. Good afternoon again to everybody. Ms. Fo, again, thanks for your passion. It comes through in your presentation, and I appreciate everything you do for housing in your community. But I want to get your thoughts on Vancouver's community entity under the designated community stream of Reaching Home being changed from Van City to LUMA in the past year. How has the transition to an Indigenous-led entity affected the delivery supports for those experiencing homelessness in the area, and particularly Indigenous folks who are experiencing homelessness there? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. I think that the answer lies within the question itself. The transition to an Indigenous-led organization is one less barrier to the people that are experiencing homelessness on the streets of Vancouver. And I happen to have had the privilege when it was transferred over to LUMA to go and do some consultation processes. And one of the critical things is their ability to see the lens of need for the community from an Indigenous perspective. So I would say it's been fantastic, and I would highly recommend, as I said in my opening presentation, anything about Indigenous should be led for and by Indigenous peoples. And so I think it's been fantastic.
Can you give me specific examples, though, of how it is better? I absolutely agree with you that it is better, but can you just give us, as a committee, examples of things you've seen that you're more responsive?
Yeah, for sure. So probably the first one is economic. When we started doing the analysis with LUMA, we saw, and they know the numbers better than I do, but what they did was they took a look at the allocations of dollars for homelessness in the province of British Columbia. They took a look at the statistical representation of Indigenous peoples in British Columbia, and they said, let's go back to the drawing board with the government of Canada and say, if we represent 30% of all, and it's $100 million that's coming through. And again, they know the numbers better than I do. I'm trying to scratch my memory on how it went, but then take a redistribution of those dollars and allocate the 30% to urban Indigenous homelessness, which meant that people like our housing providers that maybe never had access before could actually gain access to meet the needs of their urban Indigenous homeless people. And then from a more tangible perspective, just walking and talking the streets downtown Vancouver, we hear a level of comfort about approaching and reaching out for support services because there are Indigenous people leading those solutions.
So if you had to make a recommendation, like MPV said, I'm here to learn too, and certainly I'm learning more and more every day about this important file. But if you could give a recommendation to the federal government, like what lessons should our federal government take from this experience when it comes to crafting a strategy for Indigenous and particularly urban Indigenous housing? What would you recommend we do moving forward?
Well, I believe that the government has already received a document from the Canadian Housing and Renewal Association called the For Indigenous by Indigenous Strategy. So it would be taking a look at assisting the urban Indigenous organizations that have been working together over the decades to come together in a more formal process. Perhaps it's I think about what CMHC did recently with the Community Housing Transformation Center was a quick turnaround solution that brought together an organization that can create transformative change for the housing sector. I think we could do something quite similar in terms of an urban Indigenous-led national organization and have us at the table to help draw the solutions rather than do these interviews and then go back and give us a solution that you think you heard. Our providers have been on the ground for 50 years. They know what their communities need, and they know what didn't work.
Okay. All right. Well, listen, Ms. Phil, thank you very much for that. And my next question is for Mr. Wall. Again, Mr. Wall, hello from St. John, New Brunswick, and thank you for your presentation. Very, very informative. I'd like to talk to you about, and if you can, expand upon how the expansion of the list of designated communities under the Reaching Home program to include 3 new communities in Northern Ontario, including Kenora, has impacted your region. If you can you just expand on that a bit?
Thank you very much, and thank you for the question. Given that it just started in the middle of a pandemic, I will say this: symbolically, it meant that for the first time, the federal government is a partner with us when it comes to ending homelessness, and so that is very meaningful to us. And it took us since 2007 to get to that. And so, with that, in the absence of that, we've had to look at entering into MOUs with nations to see how we could actually pool our resources to address those who are experiencing homelessness in the urban setting. So, from that standpoint, having the federal government as a partner is actually means that you're with us finally, once and for all, as a government.
Just real quick, can you explain how an Indigenous lens and leadership may make your new designation more successful?
Absolutely. It really matters in terms of who's asking the question as well, like in terms of programming. If I could give the example, 2 years ago, just over 2 years ago, the province of Ontario changed in terms of who was responsible for overseeing early on centers. Centers responsible for providing access to families and children with community programs and so forth. And there was a very indigenous specific stream for that. And so we worked with our indigenous, urban indigenous providers, including First Nation communities. And in gearing up to it, we did surveys and whatnot. And what we found, the results were not reflective of what we were expecting. Our communities, our off-reserve communities, are over half First Nation. So we should expect that at least half the respondents from the survey should have been First Nation. Our schools, our elementary schools, some of them, 80 to 90% of the student population are First Nation. So when we got the surveys back, there's very little representation from First Nation families. And so we actually had to go back to the drawing board and say, what did we do wrong? And I tell you, who's asking the question is just as important as the question itself. And so when we worked with our First Nation communities and we worked with urban indigenous communities like friendship centers, all of a sudden we were hearing back from families that we wanted to hear from. And it fundamentally changed how we were rolling out the programs. And with that, I'm really happy to say that while we're still early on into this, we now have in our communities at least 6 Indigenous-led childcare programs. So once, generations overdue, Indigenous families are looking after Indigenous families, and program delivery is happening the way it should be. And what we've been able to do is, in our role in leveling the playing field, because I think the other piece that needs to be recognized that even if there's a housing strategy, an Indigenous housing strategy, that we're approaching this from the beginning, there's an imbalance of power. I think that has to be recognized, that there's an imbalance of power when it comes for Indigenous people, but also by Indigenous communities in terms of land ownership. So as you're rolling out programs, if ownership in land, if that isn't part of it, Indigenous organizations will continue to be left behind. Indigenous communities will continue to be left behind, even though on the surface it looks like we have an Indigenous strategy. So, with that example, I just want to say that it's so important in terms of who's asking the question. And then from a technical standpoint, let's keep it simple. This is about housing. And let's make sure it results into homes being created, that we don't put all our energy in the bureaucracy of getting housing happen. And I can give you a couple examples of where we see some limitations.
I'm going to have to cut you off there. We're a couple of minutes over. And
maybe somebody else can follow up, but thank you.
Sure. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Wall. Thank you, Mr. Long. Suite, Madame Chabot, s'il vous plaît, pour 6 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Bonjour. Bonjour à nos...
Good afternoon. Hello to our witnesses. Thank you so much for participating. Madame Margaret Faux, I hope I pronounce your name right. Thank you for your testimony. If I understood well, you were very enthusiastic to the idea that the federal government would set forth a national strategy for Indigenous people. And if this strategy is not implemented, you decide that you would have your own provincial strategy by and for Indigenous people. It's a winning formula, so it seems. So, in your opinion, wouldn't that be the solution? That is, that in each province we have such national strategy. And if that's so, what kind of support the federal government could provide to provinces?
And thank you for that. Sorry, I had to wait for the translation to come through. We are going ahead with our own provincial urban Indigenous housing strategy, largely because we anticipated that the national housing strategy would eventually include an urban Indigenous housing strategy, and we wanted to hit the ground running and be ready for it. Because I also not only sit on a provincial organization and sit on national organizations, I have had the privilege of having had meetings with previous Minister Duclos, Minister Hussein, Adam Vaughan, Evan Siddell, and we knew that we were going to eventually get to a position where there would likely be some sort of an investment in urban Indigenous housing. And so here in British Columbia, we took it upon ourselves to get the ball rolling so that when or if there is an opportunity for us to feed into that, that we would be ready to be partners with the federal government. I think it is important to be abundantly clear that when I speak about the dispossession of urban Indigenous people, we never ceded our rights as Indigenous peoples because of colonization. And so we never ceded the right and responsibility to sit as equals with the federal government. And that's why we're preparing.
Do you believe that the federal government should set up a national council, an Indigenous national council on housing?
A national housing leadership, I'm speaking about the government supporting us through some form of a partnership in the creation of it. We can't create it out of nothing. You know, Henry talked about the whole who's asking the question. I mean, most of us have no equity to bring to the table. And so for us to be able to actually sit as equals, we need to have the federal government recognize we need a funding stream to help us do that. And I believe CHRA outlined some of those needs in their For Indigenous, by Indigenous document. But we want to do it ourselves, and you guys can fund it.
It's extremely clear. There were several witnesses since the beginning of our study to underline the importance of by and for Indigenous people. We have to take that into account. Do I still have time, Mr. Chair? Yes, less than 2 minutes. Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Wall. You did talk about homelessness and prevention of homelessness, and you've talked about long waiting lists and increase of 250-some% since 2011. This is very troubling. If we understand well, your organization has identified a migration phenomenon of Indigenous communities from reserve to outside of reserves. So what kind of new problems does that create in the field of housing, and does that increase homelessness?
There are not many places in Canada where when you want to attend high school, you want your child to attend high school, that you have to send that child away to another community to attend high school. But that's a reality for many of the 40-some First Nation communities that are in the district known as Kenora. If you want to seek access to primary care or you need to seek medical attention, not many of us have to get into a plane, fly a couple of hours, and then you visit a strange community and then access a hospital medical care for that reason. Not many of us are living in a home where we're sharing it with 15 or 20 other members of our family. We're talking about a 2-bedroom home that has mold issues, hasn't been invested in. We have many families that are in that situation, and what we're hearing very often is that it is better to be homeless in Kenora or Sioux Lookout than it is to be back home because of the shortage of housing. We're very involved in health transformation and getting an all-nations health system in our region, and I'm happy to say that we're making good progress working in partnership with that. But something that is quite disturbing for me that we hear very often is our elders are not accessing medical care very often because they're afraid of losing their spot in the home in their community because there's just not enough homes in that community. So we have a situation where families are not choosing to live in an urban setting. Families are forced to move to an urban setting, and that has a direct impact on our homeless population. It also has a direct impact on, as I mentioned, the number of people that end up getting stuck in the justice system. And that's, so I think from an investment standpoint, it just makes pure economic sense that we start investing in homes and maybe a little less on our judicial systems. And what I mean from that is we did a project in Sioux Lookout in partnership with Ontario Aboriginal Housing Services. There's a one-of-a-kind project really in the Ontario context. The whole goal was we take those who are chronic homeless, provide them with a home, no conditions, but all supports. It's a housing first through an Indigenous lens. And what we found, the transformation in the 20 individuals that we provided housing to was incredible. We're talking about individuals who have lived on the streets for decades, who communities really have written off, but are now looking at being enrolled in employment programs, are looking at accessing jobs. And here, on the financial piece, the return on investment, we're estimating the project will have broken even in 4.5 years. So in other words, the capital investment that went into getting that building happen will have repaid itself through other savings in 4.5 years. And providing housing, culturally appropriate housing for 20 individuals, the first year resulted in almost $300,000 in policing savings. So
thank you, Mr. Wall.
That's just one project. So one example I want to give
thank
to
you, Mr. Wall.
The thing I really want to highlight is that
next we're going to
we
go
talk
to Ms.
about
Gazan, please,
the number of
the
high percentage of Indigenous people living off reserve.
Mr. Wall, please.
But I think we also need to recognize that it's not a choice. Families are forced to move, and I think that is something that when we talk about creating homes, where those homes are created, our programs need to be flexible enough so that families and organizations who know this stuff, they're in the business of making this happen, that they can choose where it's best to support those families and where that infrastructure should go. So thank you.
Mr. Wall, it's going to be impossible for all members to be able to pose questions if you don't respect the chair and the timeline. So I would ask you please to pay attention when I attempt to interrupt and to try to get us on to maintain some sort of order here. Ms. Gazan, please, for 6 minutes.
Thank you so much, Chair, and I just want to thank, it's just really nice to have I feel very privileged to have both Henry Wall and Margaret Foe here today. I really appreciate your expertise on the area. My first question is actually for Margaret Foe. Am I pronouncing your last name right? Is that correct? Okay, perfect.
Yes.
So this was my morning. I represent the third poorest riding in the country. It's minus 39 degrees Celsius here. We're dealing with trench fever, a disease we haven't seen since the First World War. It's a disease of extreme poverty. I've been on the phone because we have a housing crisis in our community, 70% whom are Indigenous. I'm worried about losing lives here. So this government continues to promise to release an urban, rural, and northern distinctions-based Indigenous housing strategy, but we're yet to see this strategy. In your opinion, how critical is it to ensure that this strategy is released in order to address the current housing crisis we are seeing?
It's absolutely essential. Toyaksip Nun for raising that. You're not alone. We see this across the country. We see this here in British Columbia. We see that COVID-19 has only exacerbated that very real risk to life. And we know that in any given community here in BC, the statistics are anywhere from 30 to 65% of the homeless population are Indigenous. And I know based on my conversations with my partners across the country that it can be as high as 99% given some of the remote communities, and that if a urban, rural, and northern housing strategy is not put in place, you will only continue to see those numbers climb. We're outpacing population growth 4-to-1. So it makes sense that this is not going to go away without an adequate strategy in place. And in fact, our language has been there is no national housing strategy without an urban, rural, and northern Indigenous housing strategy. And that is distinct from the 3 distinction-based groups.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's just a pleasure listening to you today. My next question is for Henry Wall. So one of the things that I've been pushing for is a guaranteed livable basic income. And one of the things I've been discussing is the high cost of poverty, including the direct correlation between rates of poverty and incarceration rates. Can you imagine if we invested the $115,000 a year in federal government funding into human rights? So this is something that I've been saying, unfortunately, to deaf ears by Trudeau, who says that's off his radar. But in any case, another frustration. So we've heard from previous witnesses that in comparison to the patchwork of funding currently being offered by the federal government, that massive and sustainable investments are required to ensure Indigenous people's right to housing. Do you agree with this? And what kind of types of funding would be required in order for your organizations to meet the needs of the communities you serve? I'm talking specifically around wraparound supports for people in need of supportive housing. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. First, my apologies to the chair. When I had the interpretation button on, I was not able to hear you, so please accept my apologies from earlier. Part of having stable funding, and that's more than just 1 or 2 years, is incredibly important, especially when we're talking about from a rural, remote, and northern perspective, because government hasn't, not in a meaningful way, invested in housing. And what that has done is we've lost our capacity to develop, build, and create housing. And so when there are programs that come along, we actually spend a lot of resources on consultants and from across the country to bring in, tell us how to do this and how to build it. So from that standpoint, having a more permanent structure in terms of how resources are flow through a strategy like a national housing strategy, especially in an Indigenous housing strategy, it allows our community to start planning for it. We can start aligning our labor force with it. And if we had it for a couple of years, all of a sudden the creation of housing is also an employment program. It becomes an income program. We're not just building housing and shipping the resources out to other companies coming in and building in our community. So it really is by us, for us. And so I think that is where longer term funding would be a game changer when it comes to creating housing.
Sorry, Mr. Chair, how long do I have?
1 minute for the question and answer.
1 minute for the question and answer. Going back to Margaret Foe, one of the things we fought really hard for in Winnipeg Centre is a 24/7 safe space for women, girls, 2S, LGBTQIA. I'm happy that I worked very closely with Adam Vaughn on it and the city. I'm glad they, after 9 years, they finally funded it. How critical is low barrier safe spaces, particularly for women in response to the National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls?
Absolutely essential. It's another missing piece in the National Housing Strategy. I mean, there's enough information to stand alone on its own, but the National Housing Strategy sure has a role to play in that.
Well, thank you very much, Ms. Foe and Ms. Gazan. Mr. Mielo, please, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, and I'd like to thank both of our witnesses for joining us today and being part of the discussion. And to Mr. Wall, I want to thank you for your work for the people in our district. I know it does not go unnoticed, and I want to thank you for that. And I will direct my questions to you. One of the things you mentioned already, you were sort of getting into it and ran out of time, was the bureaucracy and making sure that housing programs are about housing. And I'm curious if you could speak more about, from your experience, some of the bureaucracy and some of the red tape that has actually made it difficult for some of these important projects to move forward.
Thank you for the question. I think this is where it's really important that, generally strategies are very aspirational. It's motherhood and apple pie, but then we get to the actual nuts and bolts of it and the financing. And something that is a challenge for especially smaller rural and northern communities is the measurement of affordability from CMHC's standpoint. And I think it's really important that when we determine median market rents and which the affordability component is measured on, that it actually is truly reflective of the community. We've actually had to undertake our own studies just so that our housing, we could demonstrate it was affordable under the programs. And that actually took about a year to do, which really set us back. So I would say that is another piece, is that really ensuring that when we determine what is affordability, that the government has good data and that the hard work is done in collecting that data. The other piece too is that if it's about housing, then let's be a little less strenuous on the financing and the financial performance. I realize they are really important, but we also have banks that do that. And so if it really is a housing funding program, really consider what are the unique cost of construction in remote, rural, and northern communities, which is very different from large urban centers. And because the other piece that's missing is that when we talk about affordable housing, we just focus on the unit that can be rented out, ignoring cultural space, ignoring that the fact that Indigenous families, it's not just one child per family. Like it could be, like in our area, our fastest growing household demographic are single lone parents with 3 or more children. So our housing has to fit that need. Really difficult from an affordability standpoint if the resources don't quite match the building reality in our communities.
Thank you. Those are some good points. I think the construction is one that often I would say the government does not do maybe a good enough job of accounting for some of the higher construction costs, obviously in rural and northern regions, as you mentioned. And I do also want to ask about Reaching Home, and obviously that's a program your organization was able to utilize, but unfortunately many other northern and rural regions were not, as I understand. So I guess could you talk a bit more with the couple of minutes remaining about some of the barriers to entry for rural and remote northern regions in trying to access a lot of these federal government programs?
I want to say too that working with the staff at CMHC and also at the ministry with respect to the Reaching Home program, we're certainly working through a lot of the details, and I would say we're making good progress. So the staff are very open to listening and making changes. What we do find is programs, whether it's provincial or federal, are very much on-off reserve. And in our region, you can walk 100 meters and you're in a First Nation community, between a municipality and a First Nation community. And if I can make any recommendation, it'd be really good to have programs, say with the Reaching Home, where if an individual, as part of a homelessness prevention plan, is better supported in their community, in their First Nation community, that we can support said First Nation community in helping create those supports and that home in that community, rather than because we can't use our Reaching Home dollars in a First Nation community, we have to find a way of supporting that individual in a community that is not their home and they feel disconnected. So this idea that the program should really foster and encourage inclusion and a sense of belonging. And so that would be my advice to any federal program, is to give as much flexibility at the local level to address the need in which fits the need from our perspective.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Wall and Mr. Melillo. We're going to go now to Mr. Dong, please, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you very much, Chair. And to Mr. Wall and Ms. Vo, thank you very much for coming today. I'm certainly learning a lot in your presentation and your answer to my colleague's question. To Mr. Wall, early on in response to my colleague MP Long's question, you were in the process of giving examples of some of the practical solutions, and I would like to offer an opportunity for you to finish those examples. I think it's going to be helpful to the committee.
Yeah, my apologies again. Learning technology here as well. We found it's really important as we're looking at programs and creating new programs. And we're a unique organization that we're one of 10 DSABs in Northern Ontario. We're neither municipal government, and we're not nonprofit. So CMHC actually had a really hard time actually classifying what these 10 organizations in Northern Ontario really were. But so for the purpose of housing, we're deemed to be a municipality. But what we're finding is that when we're really serious about what we need from a housing program, to really actually listen and understand of the families we're trying to serve. And if I could use the example in Sioux Lookout with the 20-unit supportive housing project that we did in partnership with the Friendship Centre and Ontario Aboriginal Housing Services, we had an idea of going into it, of what the intent was. The intent was to end chronic homelessness. And as we're meeting individuals that would fit as part of the tenant selection process and the project construction was still happening, we quickly realized that this wasn't just about ending homelessness, this is about family reunification as well. And so suddenly we had to switch gears. And I'm glad we did. In that particular example, of the first 20 residents that moved in, at least that we know of, they had at least 30 or more children that were wards of the Crown or in a foster care system. And so as much as it was about ending homelessness, this is about ending or bringing families together. And so we could share a number of examples, but that really was a change, an eye opener for us when it comes to program design.
Thank you. And We know it's a fact that Indigenous people overrepresent amongst those that experience homelessness. You even mentioned that you saw the correctional service as part of the housing continuum. Could you expand a little bit on that? And what do you see as a major factor contributing to this reality? And how would or how could a urban, rural, and northern Indigenous housing strategy help to address them?
I think the basic by just adding more homes, that's what we need across Canada. We just need to have more housing, period. And so what we see quite often, in particular with respect to young Indigenous men, if you don't have, if there's the economic opportunity isn't there, or you've lost hope, there's a good high likelihood that you'll end up in the justice system. You either be a victim of organized crime, or in terms of being recruited, and it's fairly easy, just if individuals have lost hope. And then once you're in the system, so an individual, a young man might be brought to Kenora with 1 or 2 charges. And then they're processed through the justice system, through the courts, and then they're released on condition or on a promise to appear, but they're not going back home. They're actually staying in Kenora off reserve. And what we found, we actually looked at 3,060 breach cases in Kenora over a period of 5 years to see what the commonalities were. And I can tell you that when you have individuals who are brought to an urban center, told to stay there, and then released, and if it was an addiction that brought them there, then to say, just don't drink, that's your condition, or don't use drugs, but then you send them on the way without supports. Within hours, within a couple of days, they're back into the justice system. So we might have a young man coming to Kenora with 1 or 2 charges. By the time he or she leaves, it's probably 20, 30 charges. And the likelihood of that young person now getting employment because of their criminal record is incredibly difficult. So that's what we're seeing, is that it really, as one of the detachment commanders put it in our region, is we have a charge factory when it comes to Indigenous young men.
Okay, I have only a minute left. I know my good colleague MP Vaughan's always a big advocate for Indigenous homelessness issues, and he consults many with regard to the Reaching Home program. Any thoughts on what improvements are needed? And this question, I would like to go with Ms. Fo first.
Short answer, if you could, please, Ms. Fo.
Yeah, so I think the biggest thing to pick up a little bit from Henry's comments are around the need for these subsidy dollars for support services. Bricks and mortar are fantastic. We do need more units for sure, but we have to recognize that the needs with our community are so substantial. We need subsidy dollars for support services, wraparound services as well, if we're going to affect real change.
Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to do, thank you very much, Mr. Dong. We're going to do the 2.5-minute rounds with the block in the NDP, so we're going to go a little longer on this panel, which will shorten up the next one a little bit. On va commencer avec...
Let's start with Madame Chabot. For 2 minutes, you have the floor. Inaudible to the interpreter? We are not hearing or seeing Madame Chabot.
Je pense que votre micro est encore
Sorry about that. Thank you. I'm sorry. Listen, it's a part of the committee report if I keep doing this. Maybe one of these days. Anyhow. Mr. Walls, it has to do with seniors housing, the lack of this housing. You know, the situation is really concerning. What approach would you prefer to address this issue of seniors so that they can stay as long as possible in their own homes, in their own communities? What would be the solution? Because we know for seniors, on top of being vulnerable, it's not just about affordable housing, it's also about safe housing. What would be the best approach to meet that need, to address that problem?
Thank you for the question. I'll say just from our experience, we've done a couple of senior home developments. These are new, and where it gets really tricky when it comes to infrastructure funding. We need to have space that allows elders and seniors age in place, and that requires programming space. And that is very difficult from an affordability standpoint if those costs aren't associated with a new development, especially around seniors housing. And so any housing program specific for seniors and elders, the funding piece should also account for programming space that can be developed so that elders and seniors can actually age in place where the supports come to them. In a northern context, our elders and seniors are being shipped all over the province and Canada to access services. And that's something that we're really looking at saying, how can we reduce that and actually bring the services and the supports on site so they can age in place?
Okay, thank you, Mr. Wall. Merci, Madame Chabot.
You mean social services? Is that what you're talking about? Food help, healthcare, support in other ways? Is that the kind of services you're talking about that are usually offered by healthcare services? Do you need a better fit there?
Just a brief answer, please.
It is a mixture. It could be from bathing service, it could be from just basic primary care, or it could help with food preparation or getting supplies.
Thank you, Mr. Wall. Merci, Madame Chabot. Finally, Ms. Gazan, please, for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. My question is for Henry Wall. We know that the federal government has and continues to systematically and willfully underfund Indigenous services and programs, and frankly, human rights. You spoke about the fact that many people have to leave reserves to go to school, young kids. We know certainly through the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal ruling that clearly stated that the federal government, willfully discriminates against First Nations kids living on reserve. We also know that as a result of this, that it has resulted in, many kids that are become at risk, leaving communities, having to go to school in urban centers. I was wondering if you could expand on that and how funding these kind of basic human rights would make a difference in the lives of young people coming from reserve.
I have a really simple and basic solution, something that's going to make a huge difference in our region, I think in many other rural and remote regions, and that is we need to have access to high-speed internet. By having that, our young people will be able to be in their community and participate in the education systems virtually. That is not an option for many of our families. And so I think that is an easy fix, in my opinion, and it would go a long way in ensuring that our young people are connected.
Just because I have very little time, so are you saying if we had in communities, for example, access to high-speed internet, then kids would actually be able to stay in their homes to get their education and not have to leave their families at a young age to go to school without support?
It would be an option, and I think if there's anything that the pandemic is currently teaching us is that we should not look at going back to the way things were pre-pandemic. And I think this is something that can be acted on very fast while the infrastructure catches up, but at least it's going to start leveling the playing field with giving access to education to our young Indigenous people.
Okay. And, thank you, Chair.
Thank
Am
you,
I
Ms.
out of
Gazan.
time? Okay,
yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Gazan. Thank you, Mr. Wall. So that concludes this panel. I want to say, Mr. Wall and Ms. Foe, thank you so much. Your passion and your expertise are evident and greatly appreciated by all. It will aid the committee greatly as we approach the end of this study. So thank you for your comprehensive answers and for what you do. So we are now going to suspend for 3 minutes just to allow Mr. Wall and Ms. Foe to be on their way, do a sound test for the next couple of witnesses, and so we're suspended for 3 minutes. are continuing our study on urban, rural, and northern Indigenous housing. Just like to make a couple of comments for the benefit of the witnesses. Before speaking, please wait until I recognize you by name. When you're ready to speak, you can click on the microphone icon to activate your mic. Interpretation in the video conference will work very much like a regular committee meeting. You have the choice at the bottom of your screen of either floor, English, or French. When speaking, for the benefit of the interpreters, please speak slowly and clearly. And when you're not speaking, your mic should be on mute. And with that, I'd like to welcome our witnesses to continue our discussion. We have with us from Adlosa Family Healing Services, Raymond Deliri, the Executive Director, and Andrea Jibb, Director of Community Planning, and from Cooperative Housing Federation of Canada, Tina Stevens, the President. Ms. Stevens, we're going to start with you for your opening remarks for 5 minutes. Welcome to the committee. You have the floor.
Good afternoon. I would just like to welcome you in my own language, Ani and Bojo, in the Ojibwe language. Thank you to the chair, the members of the standing committee, and would like to acknowledge the other strong housing organizations that appeared this afternoon before you. My name is Tina Stevens. I am the president of the Cooperative Housing Federation of Canada. I am an Algonquin and an Ojibwe woman from both Kitikit-Zibi in Quebec and Stony Point in Ontario. I have resided in London, Ontario for many years. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I join you from the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Attawandaron, Huron-Wendat, and Lenape peoples. This is territory that is covered by the Upper Canada Treaties. CHF Canada is a national voice of cooperative housing. We represent over 2,000 housing co-ops, home to 250,000 people in every province and territory. For over 50 years, co-ops have provided good quality, affordable housing owned and managed by the community members who live there. There are 3 Indigenous housing co-ops that were started under the Urban Indigenous Assistance Program, and many more Indigenous families living in co-ops across the country are valued members of CHF Canada. I believe that housing co-ops provide a safe family environment for members, especially women, to embrace their culture and community, develop and maintain self-respect, and respect and fulfill our land stewardship responsibilities for Mother Earth, to find employment, access higher education, and nurture the seeds for future generations. CHF Canada and its members are being consistently educated through the expressed truths and reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. I'm so very proud of CHF Canada. We're helping make reconciliation possible for co-ops across Canada. I'm humbled in my capacity to speak to you today about the housing needs of Indigenous people. More than 20% of urban Indigenous people live in core housing need. And for 43% of those who do have housing, that housing is unsuitable or in need of major repair. CHF Canada has made a commitment to meet those needs. We have 2 recommendations for the committee. First, we recommend the government reaffirm adequate funding for Indigenous co-op housing. As Indigenous co-ops mature out of their provided to low-income members. Indigenous co-ops have forced to sell off units to the market. I know this goes against the goals of all housing providers here today. We cannot address the lack of affordable housing and its long-term goals if we continue to lose units. We collectively can stop any loss by reaffirming adequate funding for Indigenous co-ops and nonprofits. Our second recommendation is to support for Indigenous by Indigenous housing strategy. The National Housing Strategy still does not include an Indigenous housing strategy. CHF Canada supports, again, the For Indigenous by Indigenous housing strategy released by the Canadian Housing and Renewal Association. Let's ensure Indigenous housing plans are finally a part of the National Housing Strategy. CHF Canada's Indigenous communities already directly participate in the self-determination in the decision-making process of their housing cooperatives. Inside my lived experiences as that 12-year-old girl, when my mother moved our family into a housing co-op through to today as an emerging leader, have increased my decolonization. just by living in a co-op. And which is why I give back. We can make this a country where Indigenous mother has the option of safe and affordable housing for their families too. The healing of Indigenous people is pivotal. Affordable cooperative housing must be maintained so that families can maintain their connection and that the genocide of our peoples is terminated. Thank you for this time to be able to address you, to share the hope and strength of housing co-ops across Canada, working to make reconciliation possible. Miigwech, 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 and miigwech in all 4 directions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Stevens. Next, we're going to hear from Altosa. And Mr. Deliri, are you good to go, or is it Ms. Jibb?
I think Mr. Deliri may be having issues with his devices, and my apologies, I do have a little one in the background here. I'm going to introduce myself in the Ojibwe language to start. Bojo ani jawananga nimki kwe indigenicas nimki benesi andodem miche fanishnabe kwe endao miskozi db indonjiba. Hey, bonjour, hello, je m'appelle Andrea.
Good morning, my name is Andrea. I'm a member of the Métis Nation. I live in London, Ontario. I'm Director of Community Planning with the Healing Family Services. I'm really happy to take the floor today and to speak to you.
Mentioned earlier, myself, we represent Atlosa Family Healing Services. We are an Indigenous-led not-for-profit organization with over 30 years experience working with the urban First Nations, Métis, and Inuit population in southwestern Ontario. We provide emergency shelter and a variety of services to the FNMI population. We've operated Jawanong Shelter, which is a violence against women focused shelter for Indigenous women and their children since 1989. And since 2019, we have operated the Alahim Wing Atlosa Resting Space, which is a low barrier shelter for Indigenous people experiencing homelessness in London, Ontario. Since 2017, Atlosa has led the Giwatashkat Indigenous Homelessness Initiative, which is a strategic planning process to address the overrepresentation of Indigenous homelessness in our community of London. The most recent point-in-time count conducted by the City of London showed that we have Indigenous people making up 29% of people experiencing homelessness in our community, while making up 2% of the general population. So Atlosa is located in London, Ontario, in the heart of southwestern Ontario, in close proximity to 10 First Nations and in very close proximity to 3 First Nations, so about 20 minutes away from 3 distinct First Nations communities. So historically, London, Ontario has always been a hub for Indigenous people, and so we have a lot of migration in and out of the community. Last October 2020, Atlosa launched the Giwatashkat Indigenous Homelessness Plan, a strategic plan for addressing Indigenous homelessness in our community from 2020 to 2023. It's based in the definition of Indigenous homelessness done by Jesse Thistle and in the lived experience of Indigenous people experiencing homelessness. We conducted a culture-based and Indigenous-led community engagement with over 70 Indigenous people with lived experience of homelessness. So the plan is a comprehensive strategy offering suggestions for frontline services, to community capacity building for culturally safe services, to systems advocacy. And at the core of the plan is the commitment to Indigenous-led programs, services, and initiatives, as we believe that Indigenous people have the knowledge, strength, and resiliency to alleviate homelessness for the Indigenous community. However, as we have mobilized at a community level with the creation of the Giwatashkat plan, we've done the groundwork in our community, and in attempting to achieve the strategies, we've come up against barriers to accessing resources again and again. So in London, despite having numbers on par with many designated Indigenous communities under the Reaching Home funding stream, we do not have an Indigenous community designation, and so we must compete with mainstream service providers to serve the Indigenous population in our community. So today our primary recommendation is to expand the Indigenous community designation to include London, Ontario and other communities to make this easier, because as we are the sole service provider in London for Indigenous homelessness, but we receive a fraction of the funding to serve 30% of the population. So until we achieve more equitable levels of funding and discretion over levels of funding, we're going to continue to be underfunded, and Indigenous people will continue to be overrepresented on the streets. So Indigenous agencies need discretion over funding and consistent funding. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Jibb. And I understand that we're still having problems connecting with your colleague, but it seems to me your organization is in excellent hands. We're going to begin with Ms. Falk, please, for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to Ms. Stevens and Ms. Jibb for both of your testimony. The first question, Ms. Jibb, I just want to ask you, one of the questions I had thought out in my head that I wanted to ask was just some of the barriers when it comes to funding, and you've listed one already. I'm wondering if you could explain or care to explain a little bit more in detail how that's directly affecting your organization, whether it's people that are not able to access services, or if you're not able to access the service, people getting to you, that type of thing. And also too, is there a difference with that? Because you are in an urban center and you have people coming into your area, do you know, and I don't know if you know the answer to this, but is there a difference? Would you experience the same hurdles that maybe a rural, northern, or remote organization would experience?
Thank you for that question. It's an excellent question. And so that brings up something really interesting, is the jurisdictional piece, is that so we live in extremely close proximity to 3 communities, and we see that migration to and from the communities. And so while the on-reserve community that Atlosa ends up serving in the urban center, they would fall under a rural designation. But then we see kind of a mixture of folks who end up coming in, and we have to serve them in the urban setting. But some of the barriers to funding for us as an organization is continuously having to reapply for time-limited funding. And so that takes a lot of work as an agency, and so it takes a staff resources to do the work towards applying to competitive processes towards achieving these levels, these time-limited projects. And with the projects being time-limited, we're not able to do long-range work with folks. And so housing stability for someone who's experiencing homelessness a lot of programs run for up to 3 years. And so when we're having staff on, sometimes right now, some of my staff are on 3-month contract by 3-month contract. That makes it really difficult for the participants to have some long-term stability in terms of who their supports are and the relationships that they build with people. And it also puts pressure on our staff base, because 3-month contracts are very stressful for staff.
Absolutely, and very precarious. What type of services would these staff be supplying?
Yep. So we offer a variety of programs, very small starting. We have street outreach. We have rapid rehousing programs. We have 2 housing support workers, and one of them works out of a supportive housing unit. And we also offer the resting space. And so when I say resting space, it's kind of a concept that London has pioneered, and it's very they're meant for folks with more in the moment behavior. So people who can't access traditional shelter settings, whether it's due to restrictions or behaviors or substance use or whatever it might be.
And what does your street outreach look like?
We've had 1 street outreach worker, and so we have the 1 Indigenous street outreach worker who in London, and so sometimes the street outreach worker might pair up with another worker just for safety, so we have 2 people on at all time. But ultimately, what the goal of that worker is to go out and build connections with people who are unsheltered and who may not access traditional services or mainstream access outreach teams. I'm sorry. And so that's something that we see a lot, that a lot of Indigenous people in our community do not want to speak to mainstream outreach workers. And so sometimes they'll see our outreach workers and they'll say, are you such and such, referring to the mainstream agency? And then when we say, no, we're at LOSA, they'll say, okay, great, we'll talk to you.
Wow, that's really interesting. And I think that's so important too. I think that speaks to building a rapport, especially within the community, because before we can really do anything to help somebody, we have to have that rapport and that relationship. And I think too, just with colonization and situations, issues, bad decisions that had happened throughout history, there is that distrust. Whether it's difficult, especially when you have a social worker, for example, that comes in that works for the province or the government. They're more unlikely to have that trust, and walls go up, and it's difficult to have conversation.
Absolutely, and especially because street outreach is where so much of the data gathering happens in the community. And so in London, we use the HIFIS system. So we use a shared database called HIFIS where Indigenous status is tracked. And so we've had many conversations in the community about how to get accurate data on Indigenous homelessness in our community. And a lot of that happens through outreach interactions. So when an outreach worker goes and interacts with a community member who might be unsheltered. And particularly what we hear often is being asked about your identity in a way that may not be culturally safe.
Right.
We're not going to get good data on Indigenous homelessness unless it's coming from that relationship-focused approach where somebody feels safe to talk about their identity with an outreach worker.
Thank you, Ms.
Perfect.
Falk.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Jibb. Next, we're going to go to Ms. Young, please, for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And as the MP for London West, I am so pleased that we were able to get witnesses today from London to talk specifically about some of the issues that we face in our city. I wanted to start with Tina Stevens. Tina, we've had a number of conversations. Not only are you president of the Co-op Housing Federation of Canada, but you're also a board member of the Native Intertribal Housing Cooperative, and we've discussed some of the challenges that you're facing, and one of them that you were underscoring in your opening statement was about seniors and the elders and how they're impacted by the aging out of care and what happens to them when your co-ops can't continue. Can you go on and explain some of the challenges that the elders face?
Thank you very much for that question. I appreciate being able to answer in the fashion that in the London West area specifically, we do have a number of housing members, specifically in Native Intertribal Housing Cooperative, along with Four Feathers Housing Cooperative in the City of London. And so their direct connection between both those was that when Native Intertribal, as its mandate, was for families, we had to start dealing with the pressures being organized and being impacted by with our students and our young children and grandchildren being able to go off for further higher education, and then leaving basically the housing unit as an empty nest. And so as a result of that, Native Intertribal Housing Cooperative was able to then take the reins going forward, which involved the organization for Four Feathers. And through that, we obtained federal, provincial, and municipal funding to be able to establish that particular housing cooperative that housed not for seniors and people that were mainly over the ages of 40 and above. And so a lot of that then was able to benefit the elders and the seniors in our community. As with all other housing cooperatives, and specifically Indigenous needs, though, there definitely has to be more of a need and more housing assistance and more housing created and developed for our seniors, specifically for our elders, because as you know from the stats, that off reserve, in terms of the members from the different communities, that 85% are living off reserve and they're in the urban settings. And so now in dealing that we have an aging population and trying to deal with their needs, we definitely need the development of more seniors housing, but as well to be able to continue to support Four Feathers Housing Cooperative as well in being able to make those needs and address the assistance that are directly needed under accessibility and as well as other needs in terms of affordability, and as well as maintaining their traditions and their ceremonies and having the space to do that.
How would do you think an Indigenous housing strategy would help cooperatives in Canada, and specifically maybe London?
Thank you again for that question. The Indigenous housing strategy specifically would have more of a focus placed diverse. They are quite different from non-Indigenous housing communities. And so to be able to benefit us most of being able to not only look at the deep core need of housing that is currently being impacted and felt by many Indigenous communities and specifically in urban settings, but as well in terms of the services such as at LOSA or the services that are by our friendship centers or services like No Kikwe. There's a number of different Indigenous organizations in the City of London, and that they would be able to provide other service and people would be able to connect in a more pivotal fashion of being able to not only service just the Indigenous communities, but be able to benefit them as well as their children and future generations of being able to secure affordable housing, as well as having the safety of having that housing going forward so that they can obtain future needs such as education or future employment, or being able to just be connected to their own communities that are just located outside of the City of London.
Thank you so much, Tina. If I could go to Andrea Jibb for a moment and ask you how COVID has impacted the services that you offer. I know that hotels have been used, and I know this is a concern. Long-term, are hotels an answer for Indigenous housing?
Brief answer, Ms. Jibb, please.
Yes, we have relocated our resting space into hotels, and we've been able to completely change the model. And so out of hotels, we're able to offer a transitional support model, which long-term is much more effective than emergency shelter for housing stability.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Young. Suite Madame Chabat pour 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I believe that my mic is well placed. I would like to thank our witnesses for their testimonies. Ms. Stevens, first of all, regarding co-ops, I think I understood you well. You spoke about seniors. You spoke about Indigenous peoples, and you said that these co-ops are very important. You said it in your speech, and you also talked about funding for co-ops. But I'm wondering, could you tell us more? We know that housing co-ops are different from social housing. The management is different, for example. So could you give us concrete examples of housing co-ops that are for Indigenous peoples?
Thank you very much, Shabat, for that. Yes, and overall within CHF Canada, we service in regards to all housing co-ops across Canada. And 5 of the housing co-ops within Canada are located in Manitoba, and 4 are located in Ontario. And specifically in regards to, we are a member-run driven organization that respects the voices and the needs and the decision-making process done by the members that actually live and have lived experiences in the housing cooperatives themselves, as well as in terms of having our own boards that oversee the business operations of a housing co-op daily. We also try and meet the needs of the Indigenous members that we have in making sure that they are comfortable in being able to live within their own confines, to have the respect and dignity of living in their own confines. And that is as a result of the principles that we live by. And that is, in terms of voluntary and open membership, democratic member control, members' economic participation, autonomy and independence, education, training, and information, cooperation among cooperatives, and specifically the last one is the concern for community. And with all of that, we take care of the business. We are driven by our housing charges, and specifically in regards to that, those housing charges are communally shared, collectively shared, to be able to meet all of the needs of the members in specific in each individual housing cooperative. And so with Indigenous co-ops, we absolutely looked at the 7 grandfather teachings and specifically the way that we live inherently. And those mirrored a lot of the values that Indigenous people hold in regards to being able to be self-determinative, have self-determination, and to be able to be in control of the processes and policies within their housing cooperatives.
Donc, je comprends.
So from what I gather, it's a model that you prefer, this co-op model for housing. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely. I have lived in the housing co-op as a young child. And then when I ventured out and went to higher education, that when I came back to be able to have proper employment and to be able to have a family, my first choice absolutely was to return back to the housing co-op environment.
Merci.
Thank you. My next question is for Ms. Jib. It has to do with homelessness, and thank you for your testimony. You're the only organization, from what I gather, that is dedicated to this particular issue. You've developed an action plan in a way, and you're saying that in this context, the federal government has a role to play. Can you tell us specifically what role the federal government would have? Of course, financing or funding is important, but what specific role do you expect the federal government to play? Thank you for your question, Ms. Chabot.
What the systems advocacy piece, what we envision with our Indigenous homelessness plan is that how can we affect the system so that so many Indigenous peoples do not experience homelessness in the first place? Because we know that there are factors at work that we, through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, the child welfare system is probably the #1 producer of Indigenous homelessness. And so how can we advocate not only for financial resources, but to change the systems that produce Indigenous homelessness in the first place?
Merci, Madame Chabot.
Thank you, Madame Chabot.
We're going to move now to Ms. Gazan, please, for 6 minutes.
Thank you so much, Chair, and I'd like to thank both the witnesses for being here, Tina Stevens and Andrea Jib. My first question is actually a follow-up to you, Andrea, and your comments about the child welfare system. In my riding, many of the individuals who are experiencing homelessness are from the child welfare system, aging directly out of care into poverty and homelessness. We have almost 11,000 kids in care right now, most Indigenous. My numbers could be wrong. It must maybe even higher than that. We've reached a crisis during certainly COVID. We know that there's a number of kids in care that received the CERB that are now mobilizing together to ask for CERB amnesty. I support them in those efforts. Do you believe that a guaranteed livable basic income would prevent homelessness for kids aging out of care, particularly if they were provided with housing where they could choose between greater independence or housing with more supports?
Thank you so much for your question. Yes, I think a livable income is crucial to ensuring that Indigenous homelessness for youth aging out of care does not reach epidemic proportions. In our team, we often talk about Jordan's principle, and everyone knows, I'm sure knows what Jordan's principle is, that it's to address the inequities that are faced by Indigenous children on reserve. We need something like Jordan's principle to truly address Indigenous homelessness. We need funding so that people can have first and last month's rent, because in a community like London, we face levels of housing insecurity and rent costs that are that of Toronto and Vancouver. It is just not sustainable for people, let alone youth who are aging out of care, to get their own apartment in a way that feels safe for them, right? Because we know that Indigenous youth may not feel safe in a rooming house or in certain styles of apartments in certain locations in the city where they would be able to afford it.
Just adding on to that, and then I'll move on to Tina Stevens. You're talking about youth aging out of care. Another demographic, certainly very much part of the same, are individuals with severe mental health and trauma issues, often related to systems, whether it's residential school, a 60 scoop, kids aging out of child welfare. Why is it critical to have wraparound supports attached to housing? Again, we've heard a lot of comments about it's great to have bricks and mortar, but if you don't provide support, you're not setting up systems for success. Certainly, I see this time and time again. I want to hear more of your thoughts on that.
Wraparound supports are key to housing stability because individuals who have been homeless long-term often do not have the skill sets or the relationships in place to be able to navigate having and keeping a home. If you've been out on the streets for 5, 10, 20 years, like some of the folks that we work with, you don't know about budgeting or how to pay your rent or how to even go to the grocery store. Like our staff literally have to go to the grocery store with someone because they've experienced so much trauma that they don't even feel safe going out in the community alone. So wraparound supports, to build life skills are absolutely crucial, especially when considering the definition of Indigenous homelessness, that for Indigenous people, homelessness is not just being without a home, it's being without a community. And the history of colonization has displaced Indigenous peoples from the land and from our communities. And so wraparound the supports provides the relationships and the trust to keep people feeling safe in their homes.
Just very yes and no. So do you feel that when a housing project is funded, that wraparound supports need to be included in that? Yes or no?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Moving on to Tina Stevens. I appreciate your contributions around co-op fund housing. I'm a big fan of co-ops in general, but certainly co-op housing. I want to focus specifically on people living with disabilities, as we know that Indigenous peoples living in Canada experience higher rates of disabilities and much higher than the Canadian population. Can you speak about the importance of ensuring the rights of Indigenous people living with disabilities are upheld in housing and otherwise? I think you're on mute. That's the famous COVID line at Tina Stevens. You're on mute, I believe. Sorry. Or if you don't feel, maybe if you could comment, Ms. Jib.
Could you repeat the question?
Sorry,
please?
I'm not hearing anything.
Oh, you didn't hear anything. Sorry. Can we get the time back, Chair? Is that possible?
Just if you could just pose the question, and we'll go ahead and pose the question. We'll have our answer. We'll just extend it. Yep, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I was saying that I appreciated your presentation about co-op
I'm going to try
housing
and
and
leave the meeting, and hopefully you'll just accept me back in, please.
Okay.
Oh, I can hear you now.
Oh, you can hear me now?
Yep,
Can you
I
hear
heard
me now?
somebody.
Okay,
Yep.
perfect. So what I was saying is that I appreciated your contributions around co-op housing. I'm a big fan of co-ops in general, I said, but certainly co-op housing. I want to focus specifically on this question around persons living with disability, as we know that Indigenous people experience higher rates of disability than the rest of the Canadian population. I wanted you to speak about the importance of ensuring the rights of Indigenous people living with disabilities are upheld in housing and otherwise. Thanks.
Briefly, if possible, Ms. Stevens, go ahead.
Yes, thank you for that question. Absolutely, like many of other rights of peoples and Canadians all across Canada, as well as Indigenous populations, to be able to have the dignity and respect of being able to live in their housing unit, to be able to flourish and to be able to connect with their communities, as well as being able to participate in a good way in regards to the community that surrounds them. And so addressing disabilities is a high priority of being able to make sure that they are able to function and to be able to continue being active in the world, in their society, and their communities. So in terms of for Indigenous communities under the Cooperative Housing Federation of Canada, we specifically look at those assistive devices and equipment as being high priorities of making sure that they can continue to live their lives and live it as close to normal, as well as being able to sit with their families, to be able to reconnect with the communities, and to be able to function normally on a daily basis as best as possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Stevens, and thank you, Ms. Gazan. Colleagues, we're about 5 minutes from the appointed hour, and we do have a little bit of committee business to deal with. So I regret having to cut the questions so short, but if we're going to stay on time, that's what we're going to need to do. So I will take this. So my apologies to Mr. Kent, to Mr. Turnbull, and the others who were in the queue. We did have some technical difficulties, and your chair is a bit rusty in terms of keeping people on schedule, so I bear some of the responsibility for this. To our witnesses, thank you so much. As you can tell, there's a great deal of interest and probably appetite for further questions and conversation, but we're grateful to you for being with us. Ms. Jib, an admirable job carrying the load of two. So thanks once again for what you do. Thank you for being with us. Your testimony will be of great assistance to us as we wrap up this study. So I wish you a good evening. Colleagues, please stand by. There are a couple of things. I don't think they're going to take very long in terms of the meetings upcoming. So for Thursday, we will have another full panel of witnesses in connection with the study that we're doing now. But you will recall that one of the things that we did at the outset of this study was we invited the Parliamentary Budget Officer, and we accepted or moved certain terms of reference for the Parliamentary Budget Officer. The timeline that we set for the PBO to submit a report, the PBO has asked for an extension. They've asked for an extension until February 11th, and they will be able to come before the committee on February 16th, so the first meeting after the break week. They're going to provide the committee with an embargoed version of the report on the 10th, and they want to have permission to hold a briefing with the departments who provided data with for the report on the 11th. So what I require, I think, off the hop is a motion from someone to extend the time for receipt of the report from the Parliamentary Budget Officer to February 10th, and that the PBO appear on February 16th. would someone please bring forward that motion? Then we'll open the floor for discussion. Thank you, Mr. Vaughn. Any discussion?
Sorry, yeah, I just
Yep.
want to discuss it as well.
Okay.
I'm a little concerned the PBO offered to do this report for us, and now they're slowing down our report. And one of the things the PBO says is quite often they calculate is the speed at which we get reports out, funding out the door, and yet they're the cause of the slowdown now as we try to get this report finished. So I'm just a little concerned that the PBO offered and sort of talked us into receiving a report, and now is talking us into a delay of the report. I'm just wondering what that does for the rest of the studies that are backed up behind this, as well as how we get things like the Rapid Housing Initiative update that Member Viss asked for. It just seems a bit odd that the PBO can't make a report on time or on schedule, even though it was their idea.
Yeah, fair comment. That just with respect to the Rapid Housing Initiative, as long as we can.
Before we move on, I can see that there still are witnesses here on screen. Madam Chabot, could you repeat that? On screen, I can see that we still have witnesses at the meeting. Yes, but we are not in camera at this point. Ms. Jibb and Ms. Stevens?
I again want to thank you for being with us. You're welcome to stay, but you're free to leave. I don't anticipate there'll be any further questions for you. So thank you so much. Merci, Madame Chabot.
Thank you, Madame Chabot.
Mr. Chair, may I speak, please? Just for 1 second.
Go ahead.
I just wanted to make sure, because of the fact that there was a decrease in the allotment time for the last two panelists, is it possible then to respond to the questions in a more detailed fashion to be able to follow up and send that to your committee?
100%. Yeah,
Okay.
and we would very much appreciate receiving any additional information you wish to provide.
Okay. Again, thank you very much for my time here today.
Thank you very much, and thanks for your interest in providing us with more information. It's greatly appreciated. All right, Mr. Vaughn, your comments are well taken with respect to how this might impact the update on the rapid housing. We have 2 meetings next week, one of which could be dedicated to the rapid housing update if we have a witness. So this shouldn't impact the fact that the PBO is coming on the 16th. Shouldn't impact that at all. It's the only thing. It's the availability of witnesses is the issue on the rapid housing update. And did I see somebody else with a hand up?
Well, just to finish my point, it delays the drafting instructions, which means it delays the report coming back, and that's we have a budget coming up, and the goal since last year has always been to get this report into the hands of the minister, to get it in the hands of parliamentarians, so that we can assess whether or not the budget meets the aspirations of the Indigenous housing providers across the country. So I'm a little concerned that PBO is slowing us down as we try to achieve on this file, and that's the only concern I'm raising. I'm wondering if it's possible for them to submit their report as opposed to us having. I mean, I just trying to figure out the timetabling on this. So maybe if what you could do is sort of back time us from when you think we're going to have drafting instructions issued to the staff, and then figure out how we fill in between that and the PBO appearing. I know RHI is one issue, but there may be other issues.
Okay, so in terms, my anticipation is that if we have the PBO on the 16th, as they suggest, the back half of that meeting would be drafting instructions. So I don't think it's right to prepare the drafting instructions until we've heard from the last witness, and if the PBO can come on the 16th, they would be the last witness. Recognize Mr. Kent, please.
Well, no, I take your counsel, Chair. If that is the case, I share to a certain extent Mr. Vaughn's frustration that the PBO on making the offer is late in providing the report. I wonder if it's possible to request that the PBO submit at least a summary sooner than the delay that has been requested for the full report.
Yeah, I don't think there'd be any harm in asking for that. They indicate that it's going to be ready on the 10th, so you would think that a summary would be possible before that. I think that's reasonable. Any further interventions? Even though Mr. Vaughan spoke to the motion, I'm not sure that there has been a motion moved.
Sorry,
go
Chair.
ahead,
Just
Adam. Yep.
so we have maybe just block out the next sort of 3 weeks and where this all fits in, so we can sort of understand how it's being composed and what we have left to do on this file, what we have to do on rapid housing, and then what other gaps there are to see if we can either start another study or fill those gaps more productively.
Sure. So here, and this is all okay. Let me map out the thinking on the timeline. So the next meeting will be another panel on this study, and then we have one more week before a break week. The one of those meetings will be dedicated to an update on rapid housing, subject to the availability of witnesses. I do believe it would be appropriate for the subcommittee to meet to plan what studies we will be commencing on February the 18th after hearing from the PBO, given that we do have a long list of motions for studies. So the subcommittee would meet. One of those meetings, that report would need to be ratified by the full committee, probably at the second of those meetings next week. So we're talking February 2nd, subcommittee, February 4th, in camera to adopt the subcommittee report and any other committee business. A break week, February 16th, the PBO, February 18th, the commencement of the PBO and drafting instructions, February 18th, the commencement of the next study. All of that on the understanding that if witnesses become available on the 2nd or 4th, that half of one of those meetings would be dedicated to the Rapid Housing Initiative. So that's where that's the rough plan, subject to discussion and adoption by the subcommittee and the full committee. I recognize Mr. Turnbull, please.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. I wanted to make a plea to the committee to consider one more witness that whose name I put forward quite a while ago, and I understand was sort of lost, maybe potentially in the changeover between our clerks. And his name is Jesse Thistle. Ms. Gibbs actually mentioned him in her testimony. He's a Métis gentleman that spent better part of a decade homeless in across different cities in Canada, and he wrote the best-selling book called From the Ashes, and he's now a lead scholar in history at York University, who's written about intergenerational trauma. So he has lived experience. He's rewritten the definition of Indigenous homelessness. He's written a best-selling book and is someone who's healed himself over many years to come back from sort of chronic homelessness and overcome much of his intergenerational trauma. I think he would be a great witness, and I had put his name forward, and I'm really hoping we can find a way to include him in this study. And I know that I think we had a little discussion, Mr. Vaughan and I sort of loosely talked, potentially, I wonder if this solution would be amenable to the committee, which is, I think half the meeting is in the future is dedicated to the Rapid Housing Initiative. Potentially, could we have another panel of witnesses for a part of that meeting where we could have Jesse Thistle appear? I think it would really benefit the study.
Okay, Mr. Turnbull, thank you. I'm going to suggest that this be moved to the subcommittee, which to deal with these things, and then and for a fulsome discussion, and then back to us. I'd really like to get back to actually having somebody move a motion as to whether we're going to accept the PBO's request. So I see Ms. Gazan and Mr. Vaughan. Ms. Gazan, you have the floor.
Just very quickly, Chair, thank you very much. I agree with Mr. Vaughan. I think this study is timely. It really concerns me that it's being stalled after spending such a great time in this study. I think the information, particularly right now in a pandemic, certainly in my riding, I need to get this out. so that we can move forward in a way that's going to save lives. So I share that a very urgent concern that we don't allow this study to be stalled. I'll just leave it at that, but it is a very deep concern for me.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Vaughn?
So to try and resolve this, it looks like we have a meeting on the 26th, the 28th of January, the 2nd of February, 4th of February, 16th of February, and 18th of February, if I've got that right. We have one more slate of witnesses to go on the 28th, and that nothing's going to change that. The question then becomes on which date the Rapid Housing Initiative update happens. I should have an answer by Thursday on you for that. We were pretty certain we'll have the minister plus CMHC officials to share an update and provide information. That leaves sort of a gap on either the 2nd or the 4th based on when the minister can come. What I would propose doing is getting you that answer Thursday as whether it's the 2nd or the 4th, and then at that time we can decide how we slot in Jesse Thistle as sort of a last witness on this study, and get the Rapid Housing Initiative, which gives us if we're lucky, will give us a gap day that we could probably do the committee business on, and get. I believe there's a conservative study and a block study that are lined up next, and just line up what that looks like, and it will give us the ability on the 18th to hit the day the blocks running with witnesses instead of starting our study on the 18th. So it would allow us to speed up, like take advantage of the PBO delay and allow us to speed up one of the opposition studies, which is already in the queue for more evaluation. I think there's an EI study with the Conservatives that we talked about that would be apropos at this time as we move towards the budget. So the motion would be to hear the PBO on the 16th and do our drafting instructions on that particular date, to use either the 2nd or the 4th based on the minister's availability for a Rapid Housing and a Jesse Thistle invitation, and then use the other remaining date, either the 2nd or the 4th, to effectively schedule and start the next study, so that on the 18th we take witnesses on the 18th and get the study underway.
This is getting into subcommittee business, or is that a motion there, or is that debate?
I think we finally have a motion.
Yeah, it's Brad. The attempt here is to be respectful of the decision we made to get to a new study fast, to get this one done, and the PBO just sort of has to let us restructure when those dates start. And so rather than initiating the start of a study on the 18th, we do that on either the 2nd or the 4th, so we can hit the ground running on the 18th with one of the studies that's in the queue.
Madame Chabot, s'il vous plaît.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Listen, I'm not sure I followed everything there. The motion, verbal motion, oral motion, and that included some kind of schedule. I think we should get it in writing so it'd be clear. And then we could make a decision on Thursday if you wish. What I did remember from what came out of subcommittees, one of our first priority, actually, 3 motions were carried. Current affairs on Indigenous housing. We'll finish with that this week. Anyway, we'll stop hearing witnesses. The second priority is this rapid housing, and the third is the reform of unemployment insurance. I'm trying to see here what is being planned. I'm not really sure because it's been oral only. I would really appreciate having a written motion. We already have witnesses for Thursday. Maybe it could be clearly formulated and have a copy of that schedule. I agree. We don't want to delay our works. Thank you.
See, Madame.
Thank you, Mrs. Chabot. Monsieur Vaughan. Cela me semble raisonnable. Je vais donc rédiger un horaire temporaire. Je vais déposer ça jeudi. Mais entre-temps, on doit entendre le DPB et avoir des directives de rédaction le 16. Et jeudi, j'aurai également les dates.
Président. Oh.
I'm sorry, she didn't have translation because there was a problem with the channel. Could he repeat? Could Mr. Vaughan repeat, please? Thank you.
translation is on the wrong channel because I'm getting English in my ear simultaneously.
Okay.
But,
Do you want
the
put forward that
proposal
motion
was
again, please? Yeah. Go
so
ahead.
the motion would be that I'll return with a proposed schedule for Thursday, so it's written down. But that in the interim, we schedule for February the 16th both a drafting session as well as a report from the PBO. And I will also return on Thursday with a date for the minister and RHI for either the 2nd or the 4th. So we'll have it all locked down for Thursday with the variables that we discussed. And we can deal with it between now and Thursday. And I'll reach out to colleagues to make sure we have a consensus motion presented.
All right, we're about to be kicked out of the meeting room. I hope that there's no further interventions. Are there any further interventions? Excellent. Do we require a vote on the motion? Do we have consensus to proceed with the invitation to the PBO on the 18th and further discussion on future business on Thursday? I believe we have consensus. Do we have consensus to adjourn? We have consensus again. Thank you very much, colleagues. I hope we didn't get anyone in trouble for overstaying our welcome, but welcome back, and we'll see you Thursday. Have a good evening. We're adjourned.
Goodbye.